appreciate, Traci, your time with us today. And this is Traci Smith, and she is pastor at Elmhurst Presbyterian Church right outside of Chicago, Elmhurst, Illinois. And she's pastored in Michigan and Texas, holds an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and is also the author of a book called Faithful Families. I'm interested, Traci, how that book came about, how as a pastor you have this kind of passion for faith at home.
Yeah, so I came up with the idea for Faithful Families after I'd been in ministry for about 7 years, and really loved the pastoral care aspect of it, being at the hospital, being at people's bedside, and then also enjoyed aspects of ministering to children and families. I remember one little boy, Caleb, who had his first goldfish die, and he asked if he could bury it at the church, and we did a little moment about that and talked about what it means to die and return back to the earth. And so then after I had my first child, my oldest child, I was on maternity leave, and he got sick, and I just had this little instinct to do a little blessing for him, a little prayer, and I took some baby oil and kind of rubbed on his chest and his head. And I thought, oh, this is kind of like something that I would do as a pastor, but also as a mom. And so being on maternity leave, I had a bunch of time to just think about stuff in the middle of the night. And I started thinking about a lot of the sort of faith development books that I'd read in seminary, not sort of lacking an insanely practical component, and thinking about what would it be like to have a guidebook for families where we could show practices complete with a how-to, sort of like a recipe. So my original idea was to make it a series of blog posts, and then I kind of happened upon publishing and it became a book. But the original idea was just to give parents practical things rooted in theology that I felt like was, I could stand behind, but not kind of spend a lot of time on the background, just have the practices be informed by that. So that was how I kind of came about it.
I think it's interesting that you tell this story about being a pastor, but also being a mom and having these kind of worlds converge, because I've experienced in ministry that I have my ministry life and my parental life. Mm-hmm. And even though I think about Christian faith formation all the time with other people's kids, it's really difficult to do at home. And there have been numerous times I've found myself going I should be able to do this better, and yet feeling at a complete loss with my own kids as to what to do and how to invoke those things. Have you experienced something like that? And why do you think it's so hard for parents to bring faith into the home?
I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, the pastors having issues with it. It's like what's that saying about the cobbler's kids have no shoes, or whatever, or what is it, the shoemaker's kids have no shoes or something. I wrote a book on it. I'm writing another book on it, and I don't know if we do as many. We certainly don't do all the practices in the book, but actually I think that's the key, right? I think I just went to a talk actually last night by Julie Lithcott-Hames. She wrote the book How to Raise an Adult. She was a dean at Stanford. She talks a lot about the sort of over-parenting and helicopter parenting, and how what we want for our kids is pretty substantial. We want them to be successful and, have well-rounded resumes and so forth. So part of it, I think, is that we get, it's like there was a Newsweek cover called, I forgot what it was, The Myth of a Perfect Mother. And it showed this mom with all these arms coming out of her. Like one was a basketball, one was, all these different things. And so it's like faith formation, if we let it, we can sort of say to parents that that's another thing that you have to do, and I think that's, for me, something to resist. It's not that, on top of feeding them nutritious food and sending them to school and tutoring them, that we have to lob on faith formation on top of it. I think it's how do we find moments of our daily life where we can bring faith in and talk about it, sitting at the table. I'm a big fan of, being in the car, trying to integrate these things that we do the faith perspective, right? So I think it's hard because we don't have time. It's hard because maybe for pastors, we overthink it. Maybe for non-pastors, they underthink it. And then also we have a whole generation of people that are either kind of done with the overly programmed, overly like indoctrinated evangelical background, or they grew up kind of sporadically in the main line, but didn't really get it, right? So I think there's a lot of different reasons depending on what your background is, your perspective.
What do you think we can do about it as pastors, as church leaders? I know there are some in kind of the family ministry movement that are like, hey, parents are the primary disciplers, so we need to push discipleship back on parents. We need to equip them to be the primary discipler. I don't get the sense that that's what you're talking about.
It kind of is. I mean, I do think that. I think, in my own congregations and all my colleagues' congregations, it's rare to have a family that's showing up every Sunday with their families in tow, right? So if you think about the amount of time that we have in the church to do it, you're looking at like 4 hours a month, maybe. So to be able to try and empower parents, I do kind of resist. I mean, obviously I'm a pastor, so I resist the idea that like, oh, you can just do it at home. It's like, do it yourself faith. Like you don't need a church community. That's not what I'm saying. But I do feel like when we get families, in the door, what can we do to empower them to do things at home? I'm a huge fan of trying to make it as simple as possible and trying to get everybody on the same page, right? So maybe we model during I think the children's message is a time for that. It can just be a little teaching slot for everybody. So what if we teach everybody the Lord's Prayer in an interactive way? And then we say, okay, everybody, like for the next, 6 weeks, you do this at home and let's see how it goes, right? Instead of sort of laying out this whole curriculum and trying to get parents to follow it, right?
Mm-hmm. What is the essence ultimately of what you tell parents in faithful families? Because it sounds like you said, you don't do all the practices. It's not a checklist necessarily, but what's the hope as people engage that book? Is it to merely bring faith into the home in some form or fashion, or is there something a little bit deeper than that even?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I use a recipe book as an analogy a lot of times, right? Like some people, they don't like to cook, but they need to feed their kids. So they need to follow it exactly like point by point. And then other people can kind of use it as bones. I just finished writing a prayer book for young kids, and the kind of the philosophy of that book is to take certain theological concepts and just repeat them over and over and over. So in Faithful Families, for example, there's kind of a nod to bringing the liturgical colors into your home in some way, so that when you do go to church, you see, red on Pentecost. You've talked about that at home, and you have maybe a red cloth at your table, and trying to connect holidays back to faith, right? So Advent is not all about making a huge list of things I want for Christmas, but trying to do maybe the Advent wreath at home. I mean, the thing about it is like, this isn't new. Like the stuff in my book isn't new. I'm not the first one to talk about doing an family Advent wreath at home. The church's been doing it for forever. Just kind of a repackaging of some of those things. And then hopefully, the people that have glommed onto the book the most have been Christian educators, which I've appreciated. They've been able to talk about the book, present it to their congregations. And then some people buy it just kind of like they find it on Amazon, don't really have a church community at all. And I think that makes it hard to kind of figure out where I'm going with all of it. But
yeah. So what's interesting is you're not talking about then taking faith formation and moving it into the home as much. Right. It sounds like you're taking faith formation and saying, look, there are different components to it that have to be put together, and there need to be connections between what happens at home and what happens at church and what happens in other places.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, so I'm sure you studied with Kenda Dean at Princeton, maybe? Yeah. So, I mean, I'll never forget one of her classes. Just she made the simple point that I kind of reiterated in the book, I think, about, everything we do with kids. We want to teach them baseball. Like, we're in the backyard with the bat and the ball. We don't just expect them to kind of absorb it through osmosis, but somehow that's what we do with faith. Like, oh, well, you just kind of pick it up, but that's not actually true. Like, we need to practice these things. And Sunday school, is so rooted in, the kind of factory kids that are coming to school on Sunday to learn to read and write, right? And so I don't think a school model is necessarily the best way to learn faith, right? You're not practicing, depending on your curriculum, right? But, learning about faith, as we all know, is not the same thing as practicing our faith and experiencing God together and growing in faith as a family.
Yeah, like we don't expect kids who play on a competitive baseball team to only practice at practice, right? They're immersed in a family structure and a friend group that they're playing baseball or talking baseball all the time. So exactly. Yeah, why do we do that with church? It reminds me in some ways, John Westerhoff, who is one of the great Christian educators, said that really in the 19th and 20th centuries in America, there was an ecology of faith. There were different parts of society that were connected together and were part of the fabric of faith formation, so that Sunday school lessons were reinforced by what he refers to as Christian periodicals, magazines and books coming into the home that reinforced those Christian ideals. And public school even, with like the McGuffrey Reader, where these lessons were deeply embedded with faith. And so public structures and societal relationships and all of these things, he calls it this kind of ecology of faith. And so I think it's interesting, this connection between what's happening in the home with liturgical colors and then what's happening in the congregation. So, I mean, in some ways, are you kind of advocating for a reestablishment of this kind of ecology?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so John Roberto, who's from A Vibrant Faith, I think that's the name, and Sharon Eli Pearson, who's she's an Episcopal Christian educator. I've learned a lot from both of them, and they argue that, and you're sort of informing me that it's not, that they maybe are more rooted in Westerhoff or others that have come before them who have sort of noticed, like, look, it's not, we need to kind of come at this from all angles. And I think that that's true. I think that our church is changing, certainly is changing, the main line. And so how do we kind of, what are the, tendrils or branches or different areas or that can intersect for faith formation for our kids? We don't expect only our teachers to educate them. We shouldn't expect only our pastors to provide faith formation, but we need to kind of look into resources and so forth so that we have what we need, foundation.
So what would you say are the kind of components of faith formation as you've seen them play out, the components in this ecology that involve families and parents?
When I see churches that are working really well, they're doing intergenerational, Rich Melheim, who's somebody that I appreciate, he talks about edu worship. It's like a made up word, but it's like these moments where we're worshiping together, but also bringing kids along, teaching what we're doing as we do it. There's the messy church movement and all kinds of different, maybe curricula that do this. And then I think the missional church, right? Not so much doing mission as a church, but going out into the world. I've learned a ton from Mark Yaconelli about storytelling, which I think is critical. Andrew Root as well talks a lot about storytelling and the importance of being able to tell your own story in order to understand the stories of Scripture, right? The Scripture, we want to make it into lessons, but what is the whole of Scripture? Story after story after story. Faith formation at home is kind of where I live. I'm also a huge proponent, not for kids so much, but for getting parents in online spaces where they tend to live and hang out anyway. So is there a way to, kind of pull together some sort of a digital community. And then in my world, when I speak to Christian educators, I feel like there's this kind of movement toward intergenerational movements all the time. And people can't really, first of all, agree on what intergenerational means to them. But I hear people sometimes getting, I think, kind of snobby about that, saying like, oh, you know, the time for breaking up kids by age is over. We need to bring everybody together in the same room, in the same place. And I kind of push up against that. I think there are places to put, you know, young ones together and high schoolers together because they're at different stages maybe in their faith development. Let's see if I got everything. I think that's it. Yeah, those are all of them.
Yeah, you know what I think is interesting about that is it's a really helpful corrective, I think, in the context of delving into family ministry writing and parent ministry writings, where it's easy to come away and go, okay, what we need to be doing is getting kids and parents talking about faith. But you're saying that's actually not the only thing that needs to happen. If that is the only thing that happens, then we're losing this larger ecology, of which that is a piece.
Exactly. Yeah, so I agree.
It's that like throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing that I think we often, no, it's not this, it's that. Well, maybe it's both.
It's both. Yeah.
So I mean,
I think people are resisting. Like people are saying, look, you know, we've looked at the research, and taking kids out all the time of worship and then putting them in youth group and then, you know, kind of vacuuming them out from the community is bad for kids. And that's true. I think that's true. But I think the overreaction then is to kind of do away with youth group altogether. And I think there's something about, you know, like being an adolescent, like you want to be with your people sometimes, right? So I think we can't really say yet. I think we're still in the middle of researching these correctives toward really programmatic age segregated ministry, and we can't really say what works and what doesn't yet. Interesting.
Yeah. So the need for intergenerational worship, you said, and then intergenerational teaching, it sounds like too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
And then kind of a youth group, age and stage kind of thing. Missional activity. Tell me more about what you mean by that.
When I talk about missional, I mean like going out into the community, you know, and seeing what's out there. I'm doing a sermon series on that right now with my congregation, kind of told the story of being in San Antonio and having a random Sunday off and walking around this place that was called the Pearl. It was like this beautiful kind of marketplace, restaurant place, and it was packed. And as a pastor, I was like, oh my gosh, like, there's this whole world out there on Sunday mornings, right? And being able to converse with the culture and understand it and find ourselves out there, you know, I think there's, I've heard some people doing some kind of fun things, maybe Fifth Sundays, closing their doors and going out and going out into the community and either serving or learning or observing.
Does this best happen, do you feel like, with families, with the intergenerational church as a whole? I mean, I know the model in youth ministry is for us to be like, oh yeah, mission and service. We're going to send our teams out to do some mission and service. And I imagine that some of the folks listening are like, yeah, we do that already. Is that missional enough, or is there? I'm talking more about like closing up the church, heading out, you know, as a church into the world, and not so much a model of we serve you, right? But like we're out here in the world, and we want to learn from each other, and we want to share with one another. See, you know, I think there's no way with our culture such as it is, at least in the mainline, that we want to raise kids that aren't kind of fluent in the language of our culture, right? We want kids to be able to explain Jesus to others in a way that they can understand and they can experience. Yeah. Specifically with that component, with that whole ecology, with the component of faith formation at home, as you think about some of the major practices that you have explored in your book, or in this second book even that you're working on, what are some of the ones that you feel like we should be paying the most attention to as pastors, as leaders, to try to get people really practicing at home or experiencing?
Mm-hmm. I think prayer, that's why I wanted my second book to be focused on prayer. And in that book, it's kind of really young. It ended up getting aged down a little bit by the publisher, which I was resisting at first, but then I've come to really embrace it, because if you kind of look at the words that you teach your children to pray, I mean, your entire theology can hang on that, right? So if over time, all of the prayers that you're praying with your children, at bedtime, when you're scared, when you're taking a test, if they're always emphasizing God's love and God's grace and God's mercy, you're going to have a child that kind of forms a view of God based around that. And Sandy Sasso is somebody that I really appreciate her work and her research about children and spirituality. She's a rabbi. And she says, and I've never found the study, but she has some study that she quotes saying that children, by the time they're 5 years old, have a view or picture of God, even if there's no faith formation at home, right? Mm-hmm. So, for people that are like, oh, I don't know, I want to raise my kids to be open-minded, I don't want to indoctrinate them. I think the big misstep there is they're going to come up with something based on something that they find in the culture and the playground, whatever. So don't you want to be the one that's kind of influencing that? So I think prayer is huge. The words that we say about God, that would be my number one. And then for me, serving others and talking about why we do that, and how Christ was a servant, taught us how to lead by service. Those are the things that I care the most about with my own family. And I emphasize them in the church, especially around like Lent and Advent. I think seasons for pastors, those are times in the year that you can't, that you can kind of double down on these practices, right?
Yeah, I found as a parent that those are the times of year that I feel most natural to bring this kind of faith formation aspect into my home in more robust ways with my kids. And then it allows me to maybe continue that. Because I think the hard thing is often as a parent, it feels awkward, just like, all right, now we're gonna start doing this, and you're like, the kids are like, what are we doing? And it's like, hey, it's Christmas time, so we're gonna do this Christmas thing. And then if you can keep it on. One of the big places I've noticed, at least in faith formation, is we give a lot of Advent help, and we give a lot of Easter or Lenten help, and then there's nothing. It's silence, right? Like there are no resources to continue on with your kids at home. But I'm interested particularly around the prayer piece, because I think prayer is often really difficult. It's an intimate thing to do with anyone, and especially with your kids. I don't get the sense that you're just talking about, hey, let's set aside 5 minutes for prayer, but are you talking about actual like written prayers that you engage together?
So the book that I wrote is a prayer book, right? So they're just very simple little prayers for all different times, right? So when you're afraid, or when it's back to school time, or when it's Christmas, or when it's Easter, when something scary happens in the news, right? So to kind of, they are rote prayers. And again, the idea is if you have somebody that feels comfortable, they don't have to use those prayers. They can add to them or make up their own, right? But I think, I tell the story in the beginning of the book about going to my grandma's house, and she had that prayer, now I lay me down to sleep. That one, I pray the Lord my soul to keep if I should die. It scared the heck out of me. Like, if I should die before I wake, like, oh my gosh, right? So, we need to have different words that we can tell our kids. And in terms of like faith formation every day, I think that depends on what your family is able to accomplish. Like, so I know that eating together is not something that all families can do, but I think that's a perfect time to be able to get, a gratitude practice going, Or, Rich Milheim, again, his stuff, he has this thing called Faith 5, and he has lots of support, lots of resources, where it's like you do the 5 things, and I forget what they are, but it's like highs and lows, and then you read something and you share together, and then you end up blessing one another at the end. And it's kind of, I think we have to catch up in the mainline in terms of resources, right? Like the kind of evangelical church is famous for like after dinner, dad gets out the Bible and then everybody talks, and that doesn't really resonate with a lot of our families or any of them. But just trying to find out what are these moments, these everyday moments of life, and how can we make them holy? Every day I drive my kids to school today, and say, okay, what are like the 2 most important things in our family, and they say to do our best and to be kind, right? And it's just kind of like a ritual. Every day we say that, like, okay, help us to be kind today. Amen. So these things don't have to be complicated. I think their power is in their repetition. Pick something and you do it every single day for a season, at least. It kind of, gets those neural pathways burned in there. I'm not a neurologist.
About how helping parents into that rhythm is important, right? Like, yeah, there's a lot of focus in family ministry and parent ministry literature on events, on one-off kind of things, or even occasional, but there's not maybe a lot of focus on the repetitive aspect. And you want that for your own family to be really where the power is. And
yeah, I think so. I do. I think that the doing something repeated, so we try to eat dinner together as much as we can, and we kind of mix it up, and the kids will kind of ask for what they want, like, let's do what we're thankful for, or let's do this prayer, or let's sing God is so good, it's in the purple Presbyterian hymnal, right? Like, so, if our music directors can help us out too by choosing songs in worship that are accessible for families, that helps a lot, I think.
Well, thank you so much for your time with us, and we appreciate it. And good luck with the next book. Do you have a title on it?
It's Prayers for Faithful Families.
Okay, well,
keep the brand.
You've got it branded. Fantastic. Well, thank you for it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I hope it goes really well in class.